What is significant in the Song philosophy of Zhu Xi and what made it wield a great influence in China and Japan in the most practical way is its view of history. It is the development of the idea dominating the Spring and Autumn, one of the great classical works compiled by Confucius. The work was written by the master with a view to weigh morally the claims of the different states of his day in the period known as warring states. China was then divided into several kingdoms, each trying to gain the upper hand. Usurpers claimed to be transmitting the orthodox line of kingship, and politics drifted along with the fancy of the rulers, as if the compass was lost. Confucius's idea of compiling annals of his time was to establish a universal ethical standard for all the future statesmen of his country. The Spring and Autumn, therefore, embodies the practical codes of ethics as they were illustrated by the events of history. Zhu Xi followed the example of Confucius by compiling a history of China abridged from Sima Kuang's larger work, An Imperial Guidebook for a Successful Government. This was a monumental political history of China, compiled over a period of 19 years of scholarly labor in the 11th century. In his work, Zhu Xi enunciated the great principle of propriety known as names and parts, Ming Fen, which he thought ought to be made the governing principle of politics for all ages. The universe is governed by the laws of heaven, so are human affairs, and these laws require of each of us to observe what is proper to him. He has a name, he performs a certain part, as he occupies a definite position in society. He is assigned a place where he is asked to render his service to a member of the group he belongs to. This network of social relationships is not to be ignored if the peace and happiness of its components are to be preserved and enhanced. The ruler has his proper duties to perform, and his subjects theirs. Parents and children have their well-defined obligations to each other, and so on. There ought to be no disturbance or usurpation of names, titles, and parts. Zhu Xi was quite emphatic about what he called names and parts, for the northern invaders were beating hard against the kingdom of the Song. The government dignitaries were uncertain how to deal with these encroaching enemies, and some of the former were even negotiating with the latter to carry out a policy of compromise. All these scenes going on before his eyes stirred Zhu Xi's patriotic and nationalistic spirit, and he upheld his teachings strongly, even at the risk of his life, against some of the politicians who were trying to induce the government to yield to the pressure of the northerners. Although his philosophy was not able to save the southern Song from the invasion of the overwhelming Mongol armies, it has enjoyed popular support ever since, not only in China, but particularly in Japan during her feudal days. One of the principal reasons the philosophy of Zhu Xi appealed so forcibly to Chinese psychology and came to be an officially sanctioned system of thought under successive dynasties was that in its framework it comprehended, even to the fulfillment of all conditions required by the Chinese way of thinking and feeling, all the representative orthodox thoughts that had played any part in the advancement of Chinese culture. Another reason was that it was the philosophy of order dear to the Chinese heart and earnestly sought by the people in general. The Chinese are, no doubt, just as patriotic and full of nationalistic pride as any other nation, but they are more practical than sentimental, I imagine more given up to positivism than to idealism. Their feet are glued to the earth. They may occasionally gaze at the stars, for those are very beautiful to look at, but they never forget that they cannot live even for a day separated from Mother Earth. They are, therefore, attracted more to Zhu Xi's philosophy of social order and utility than to his idealism and emotionalism. In this respect, the Chinese differ from the Japanese. The following statement by Chengming Dao fitly describes the Chinese mentality. The reason the Tao is not made more manifest is the harmful interference of heathenism. This harm was more obvious in ancient times and more easily detected, but in these days it goes deeper and is harder to discern. Of old, the followers of heathenism took advantage of our ignorance and put us into a state of intellectual perplexity, but nowadays saying that they have fathomed the mysteries of existence and know the reason of transformation. They appeal to our intelligence. But their speculation falls short of exploring particular things and performing social duties. They claim the universal applicability of their teaching, but in reality they go against the moral order of our ordinary life. They state that there is nothing in their system whose depths and subtleties have not been thoroughly examined, but they are unable to follow the path of the wise men of ancient days, such as Yao and Shun." Unquote. By heathenism, here is no doubt meant Buddhist thought, whose soaring flight, however high, is not suitable, those Sung philosophers think, for the consumption of their practical and socially minded countrymen. This practicalness of the Sung philosophy came over to Japan on the same boat with Zen and with its nationalism, instilled into it by the militaristic spirit of Zhu Xi. In those latter days of the Southern Sung, there were many patriotic soldiers and statesmen, and even Zen monks, who volunteered as fighters against the aggressors. The spirit of nationalism penetrated into all the intellectual layers of society, and the Japanese Zen monks who visited China at the time came back also saturated with the spirit and the philosophy formulated by Zhu Xi and his school. Not only Japanese travelers returning from China, but also the Chinese monks who came mostly from the southern Sung to settle in Japan, brought along with their Zen the message of the Sung philosophers. Their combined efforts to propagate the philosophy of nationalism in Japan met with success in various quarters. The most notable instance was the epoch-making decision on the part of the Emperor Go-Daigo, who reigned from 1318 to 1339, and his court, to restore to their own hands the power of government which had hitherto been entrusted to the Kamakura Bakufu. This imperial movement is said to have started from the inspiration which the emperor and his ministry received from the study of Zhu Xi's history of China, and this study was carried on under the guidance of the Zen monks. It is also stated by the historians that Kitabatake Chikafusa's monumental work on the succession of the imperial rulers in Japan was a result of his pursuit of Zhu Xi. Chikafusa was one of the great literary men who surrounded the Emperor Go-Daigo, and like his august master, he was also a student of Zen. Unfortunately, the Emperor Go-Daigo and his court failed to restore the imperial government to their own power. The political abnormality that followed, however, did not mean the weakening of the Confucian learning among the intellectual elements of Japan, for assisted by the Zen monks of the Five Mountains and also by those in the provinces, it went on as vigorously as ever. During the Ashikaga period, the position of the Zhu Xi philosophy in upholding the orthodox doctrine of Confucianism was generally recognized, and the Zen monks began to pursue its study with more than zeal for sheer learning. They knew where their Zen was most needed and where the Sung philosophy was most practically useful. Thus they became its real official propagators, and their influence radiated from Kyoto out to the remoter parts of the country. This tendency on the part of the Zen scholars to differentiate Zen from the Sung philosophy as systematized by Zhu Xi and his school helped to define sharply the division of labor, or the sphere of influence between Buddhism and Confucianism in Japan under the regime of the Tokugawa shogunate. The practical spirit animating the Chinese way of thinking and feeling, especially recognizable in Zhu Xi, strongly appealed to the founders of the Tokugawa, for they were now most anxious to see peace and order quickly restored all over the country after so many years of war. For this purpose, they found the Chinese teaching most eminently suited. The first official exponents of the Sung philosophy to use Zhu Xi's commentaries were Fujiwara Seikwa and his disciple Hayashi Razan in the 16th and 17th centuries. Seikwa was originally a Buddhist monk, but he took so much to the study of the Confucian texts that he finally cast off his Buddhist robe, although he retained his shaven head for some time. After him and Razan, the study of Confucianism found its own followers, and the Zen monks were quite satisfied to confine themselves, at least officially, to the exposition of their own doctrine. We must not, however, forget to notice that as in China, in Japan ever since the introduction of the Song philosophy, there had been a constant attempt to syncretize the three teachings, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Xintoism. One remarkable fact deserving notice at this point in the history of Japanese thought is that Xintoism, which is regarded as the official embodiment of the national spirit of Japan, did not assert itself as doctrinally independent of either Confucianism or Buddhism. The most probable reason for this is that Xintoism has no philosophy of its own to stand on. It is awakened to its own consciousness and existence only when it comes in contact with one of the others, and thereby learns how to express itself. It is true that, in the 18th century, Moturi Norinaga and his disciples started a vigorous attack on Confucianism and Buddhism as imported doctrines, not quite congenial to the Japanese way of living and feeling. Their patriotic conservatism, however, was instigated more by political than by philosophical motives. They no doubt helped a great deal to usher in the new Meiji regime, known as the Restoration of 1868. But from the purely philosophical point of view, it is highly problematical whether their religio-nationalistic dialectic had much of the universal element. Having said the above, I feel somewhat uneasy lest my listeners may not be able to comprehend what Zen means to us of modern times. Everything of life nowadays shows the tendency to turn into a complete routine of mechanization, leaving nothing that will demonstrate the dignity and destiny of human existence. To illustrate further the way Zen treats of some important religio-philosophical problems, the following two examples are quoted from a classic Zen textbook, the Hekiganroku, or Hekiganroku, meaning Blue Rock Collection, or Blue Rock Records. This is a composite work of two writers from the Song dynasty, Sekcho Juken, who lived from 980 to 1052, and Yengo Bukwa, who lived from 1062 to 1135. The first mondo is as follows. A monk asked Taizu Hoshin of the Tang dynasty, "When the Kalpa end fire breaks out and consumes all the worlds, I wonder if this too is destroyed." Taizui, "Yes, destroyed." Monk, "If so, does it follow the rest?" Taizui, "Yes, it does." On this mondo, Yengo gives his comments in the following manner. Hoshin of Taizui was a disciple of Taiyan and a native of Entei in Tozen. He studied Zen under more than 60 masters. While under Isan, he served in the kitchen, taking care of the fire. One day Isan asked him, "You have been here with me for some years, but you do not seem to know how to ask me a question and see how it goes." Taizui said, "But what question should I ask you after all?" Isan proposed this. "If you don't know, just ask, 'What is the Buddha?'" Then Taizui at once put his hand over his master's mouth and shut him up. Thereupon Isan remarked, "If you act like that, you may not get even one who will sweep the ground for you." Taizui later returned to his native town, and at the foot of Mount Hoku he erected a little booth where he served tea to the passers-by for 3 years. Later, he was called to open up Mount Taizui, where a monastery was built, hence his name, Taizui. One of the monks once asked him, "When the Kalpa end fire burns up all the worlds, will this be destroyed or not?" This question comes from a Buddhist scripture in which the physical history of the universe is given as going through the 4 stages, coming to existence, continuing to exist, destruction, and finally disappearance. When conflagration takes place at the end of the Kalpa, or age, the flames rise up even to the 3rd dhyana heaven. This monk does not really know the ultimate sense of the story as it is told in the scripture. Let us ask, what is really meant by this alluded to in the question. Some give to it an intellectual interpretation, saying, "This is the original nature of all beings." Taizui answered, "Yes, destroyed." The monk further asked, "Does it, then, follow the rest?" Taizui said, "Yes, it does." This is misunderstood by a number of people who are unable to get at its true signification because they are given up to conceptualization. When Taizui declares that this is to follow the rest, where does it really go? If Taizui, on the other hand, said, "This does not follow the rest," what then? Therefore, do we not have an ancient master stating that if you really wish to get intimately to the point, you should not ask any questions? Later, there was another monk who asked the headmaster of Shuzan, "When the Kalpa end fire breaks out, all the worlds are destroyed. And will this be destroyed or not?" The master said, "No, not destroyed." The monk asked again, "Why not?" "Because this and all the worlds are identical," was the master's answer. Indeed, whether you say this will be destroyed, or whether you say this will not be destroyed, the outcome is the same. Both statements are enough to stop the breath. The first monk who failed to understand Taizui was very much worried over the matter, and went to Tosu-san of Choshu, where he wished to solve the question with the help of the master there. Tosu the master asked, "Where do you come from?" Monk, "From Taizui of Western Shoku." Tosu, "What has Taizui to say?" The monk then recited the whole proceeding which took place at Mount Taizui regarding the destiny of this. Tosu rose from his seat, and burning incense and reverently bowing towards Mount Taizui, remarked, "A Buddha has appeared in Western Shoku. You make haste and go back to Mount Taizui." The monk thereupon turned his steps back to Shoku, but when he reached Mount Taizui again, what a pity, he found that his old master had already passed into nirvana. Later in the Tang, there was a monk by the name of Keijin, who visited Mount Taizui and composed the following poem in memory of Hoshin the master. All is cleared up, absolutely alone. Who says that Eno had his seal of transmission? The dictum, "It follows the rest," has made the poor monk run over mountain after mountain. The crickets are chirping this cold night on the stone wall. The ghosts are seen worshipping in the shadow of the darkening lantern. All is quiet and serene now around the lonely shrine, and I find myself walking up and down, deeply absorbed in thoughts inexpressible. In the poem, the Eno referred to was the sixth patriarch, who died in 713, and who was given the mind seal of transmission by Gunin, the fifth patriarch, certifying Eno's understanding of orthodox Zen. The idea is that there cannot be any such thing as transmitting the Dharma from one individual to another. In the realm of absolute emptiness, or shunyata, no dichotomies are possible. Sekcho makes use of 2 lines of this poem in a versified comment on the puzzled monk. In the midst of the flaming Kalpa fire, a question is asked. The monk still unhesitatingly stands against the dilemma. What a pity! The one phrase, "It follows the rest," is proving fatal, making him wander about all by himself with no end whatever. Sekcho's verse is altogether opportune and exactly hits the mark, for he knows how to get through the dilemma on whichever horn he may be caught. It is all right when one says destroyed. It is all right, too, when the other says not destroyed. The only point that is absolutely important is to take hold of the truth itself, which transcends a dualistic interpretation of any sort. Otherwise, we shall have to follow the poor monk who travels back and forth over mountains and mountains, with no time to rest. The second mondo is as follows. A monk asked the 8th century teacher, Hyakujo Yekai, what is the most miraculous event in the world? Hyakujo answered, I sit here all by myself. The monk then made a bow to the master, who struck him. Yengo comments in this manner. He who has a discerning eye has no hesitation in risking himself when necessary, for unless you venture into the tiger's lair, you can never capture a cub. Hyakujo is a great master. He is like a winged tiger. But this monk, defying death, was not afraid of touching the tiger's whiskers. Hence this question: what is the most miraculous event in the world? He has a discerning eye, so Hyakujo takes the trouble to answer, I sit here all by myself. The monk makes a bow. This will be understood when one can go back to the time even prior to the monk's questioning. The monk's bow is not an ordinary one. The monk knows Hyakujo thoroughly, but good friends sometimes act as if they did not know each other. They refrain from giving expression to all that they have within themselves. The bow is followed with a stick. Here we see that when the master lets out, everything is at once set to right. When he draws in, all is wiped out, and not a trace is left. Let us ask, what is the idea of the monk's bowing? Is this properly done? If so, what is Hyakujo's motive for striking him? If the bowing were not proper, where is the point that is not proper? When we come to this, we find that a trained mind is needed, while standing at the highest peak, to distinguish between black and white, fair and foul. The monk's bowing is like bearding the lion in his den. He knows where and how to turn his body about. It was fortunate that Hyakujo, the old master, was not to be deceived by the tricky behavior of the monk. He had an eye on his forehead and a charm under his arms, and this enabled him to detect at once what was in the mind of the one who was bowing before him, and he wielded his stick effectively. If it was somebody less than Hyakujo, he could not have done anything with the monk. This monk, on the other hand, knows how to meet a challenge with challenge of whatever sort it may be, hence his bowing. Nansen Fuguan, an 8th century teacher, once told his brotherhood, in the middle of last night, Manjushri and Samantabhadra cherished the thought of Buddha, cherished the thought of the Dharma, and I give each of them 20 blows of my stick and chase them away to the other side of the mountains. At the time, Joshu Jushin came out of the congregation and said, Who is going to be hit by your stick? Nansen replied, What fault do you find with this old man that I am? Joshu bowed. The fully qualified Zen master very rarely overlooks where his opposing party stands, and therefore as soon as he notices a sign of something moving, he at once starts his activity in the briskest manner. The old teacher Goso Hoyen used to say, It is like the game of wrestling. No time for deliberation is allowed. All that comes in through the senses, all that belongs to the realm of seeing and hearing, have them all at once put aside. When thus you take hold of yourself and become master of yourself, you will be able to see where Hyakujo is. Unquote. But what would happen if you let go? Let us see what Sekcho would say on this point. Look at the Pegasus that freely gallops all over the patriarchal fields. When he comes down in the world of multitudes, rolling up, spreading out, how free and how altogether independent he is. Like a flash of lightning, like a spark of flint striking steel, each knows how to react to the situation. Beware of the tiger that permits no one to touch his whiskers. At this point, let me present some extracts from Yengo's comments on this gatha, which may shed light in understanding the whole procedure between Hyakujo, the master, and the monk. A monk asked Baso Doichi, What is the ultimate teaching of Buddhism? Baso struck him, saying, If I did not strike you, the whole world would laugh at me. Another monk asked, What is the meaning of Bodhidharma coming from the test? This amounts to asking the ultimate teaching of Buddhism. Bodhidharma is the first Zen patriarch of China who brought Buddhism from India. Baso said, You come up nearer to me and I'll tell you. When the monk approached him, the master slapped the monk's ear, saying, the secrets are difficult to guard. Yengo further quotes Ganto Zenkatsu, who once said this: "The best is to reject objects, while to run after them is the worst. When one finds oneself engaged in a combat, one is to be always master of the situation, whatever way it may turn." Says Sekcho, "The wheel of becoming ever remains unmoved. Once moved, however, it surely runs in two directions, between subject and object." Indeed, if it did not move at all, it would be of no use whatever. If one is really of manly stature, one ought to detect where the slightest movement takes place, for this is the way to be one's own master. People of the present day are altogether too busy running after somebody else. When they go on like this, their noses will be firmly held by others, and how can they expect to attain their end? The monk knew well, even in the midst of a lightning flash, how to turn himself about and make a bow to the master. Sekcho here compares Hyakujo to a fierce tiger, and says that the monk's parry was like trying to play with the tiger's beard, an altogether dangerous trick. To those who have not been initiated into the secrets of the Zen way of dealing with these religio-philosophical problems, the above mondo and comments will be complete enigmas, I believe. But one thing at least they will notice here is that Zen does not follow the ordinary rules of ratiocination. Zen has another way of viewing and judging realities. We may ask, why is not Zen more explicit in demonstrating this particular point instead of shrouding it, as it appears to some of us, with unnecessary mysteries? The answer will be, it is not that Zen purposely practices this mystification, so to speak, but in the nature of things there is no other way of demonstrating Zen than the one adopted by the successive masters in China and Japan. If they, like philosophers, followed the logical or so-called dialectical method, there would be no Zen. In fact, the masters are doing the best to express themselves in the most vital and most pertinent manner they can possibly follow. To say that their behavior is inevitable is more to the point. When the fruit ripens, it falls on the ground. When life is ready, it takes another form than the one it has so far been assuming. When spring comes, the field is green and we feel relaxed. When frost covers it, we shiver and see the trees all shorn of leaves. It is not that we have logic first and apply it to nature to make the latter obey its laws. Logic is a later product, and it is we who have constructed it. Where logic is not available, we must construct another which is logical. Zen is prior to so-called logic, and its masters are guiding us to an interview with a God who has not yet uttered, "Let there be light." To take up the first mondo regarding the fate of this, when the whole universe goes to destruction, one master says that follows the fate of the rest, which we may take to mean that the soul, distinguishable from the body, disappears with the disappearance of the latter. But there is another master who apparently contradicts this assertion, for he says that the soul does not follow the destiny of the body. His second statement when asked why is, the soul is the body, and the body is the soul, and as they are identical, there is no destruction of either. Or one may understand this master's view in the following way. It is a mistake from the start to distinguish soul from body, mind from world, thinker from thought, seer from seen, actor from action, subject from object, as is generally done by most philosophers as well as by men in the street. And because of this initial error, we become involved in an endless series of logical difficulties. The best way to come to a real understanding of the matter is not to ask a question, for this is where Zen is. Let the question be raised. Is this destroyed? Or is this not destroyed? And then we have an endless series of complications. If it is said that this is destroyed, we get worried over the destiny of our precious soul, or anything which we hold to be dear to us. If it is said, on the other hand, that this is not destroyed, we worry just the same over its wherefore, or its whereabouts, or its whither. The second mondo cuts off all these logical complications and physical worries, for Hyakujo is in the most positive manner affirmative and conclusive. I sit here all by myself. The philosopher, according to whom cogito ergo sum, is generally weak-minded. The Zen master has nothing to do with such dialectical quibbles. He straightway gives his final irrevocable pronunciamento. I sit here all by myself. He does not think. He is, in fact, where the thinking has not yet started. If he begins to do it, he is too late. Therefore he goes straight to I am, or just am, or is. The Zen master is a most impatient man. He will not wait for us to ask a question, for he says, if you want to be intimate with reality, no questions need to be asked, for the answer is where they have not yet been raised. A flash of lightning, or the spark of flint striking steel, does not necessarily mean instantaneity, but immediacy. When you ask a question, or when you think at all, this means mediation or time. Zen abhors mediation of any kind. It is always straightforward and wants to handle reality in its nakedness, or in its isness or suchness. Questioning and answering, or thinking, or logicizing is mediation and therefore takes time, which irritates the Zen master, who is always after immediacy. He does not want a pair of tongs to grasp fire. He wants us to grasp it with the naked hands, and the wonderful thing is that when grasped, it does not burn the hands. This is the meaning of the saying, whoever loses his life will preserve it. Is this not the most miraculous event in the world? And that Zen takes a firm hold of this miracle and asks no questions about it, is this not also a most wonderful fact in our experience? For indeed no questions are possible here. This is not the conclusion we reach after laborious reasoning. Hyakujo gives us here the whole truth without any reservation, and we have to accept it in the same spirit, wholeheartedly and unhesitatingly. But if we stopped here, there would not have been any Zen. Fortunately, if we can say so, the monk bowed and the master struck. This is something we find nowhere in the cultural history of humanity, and this is where real Zen is. I sit here all by myself may be compared to Luther's Here I Stand, or to Christ's I am before Abraham was, or to Yahweh's I am that I am. But how about the bowing in this connection? The bowing is by no means an unconscious thing. But what does it mean here as a reaction to Hyakujo's diction? Zen gives no explanation, at least verbally. Besides, how should we have it related to the master's striking? The bowing becomes a veritable enigma. And then the striking. Yengo parallels it with Baso's striking his questioners and praises Hyakujo very highly, saying that he is really the master of the whole situation and knows perfectly well how to cope with every phase of its shifting. To the outsiders, all this is beyond comprehension. What religion is this? What philosophy is this, if there is anything intelligible in it? I would not, however, go any further here except to state that Zen is the most intimate personal experience, and that all these enigmatical behaviors are directly and inevitably related to it.